Hello everyone, this is Tim Cummins from IACCM and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's webinar sponsored by our long-term corporate members and friends from 8over8 and we'll be giving proper introductions to the speakers in just a second. Our topic today, untangling your complex projects, challenges and best practices in project delivery. A very timely topic, I think. In fact, just a couple of weeks ago I was with a group of executives in California who were telling me that they've pretty much given up on doing complex projects because the failure rates are too high. Well, many of us, of course, don't really have that choice, and even if we do, it's not necessarily a smart choice. Certainly the best answer would seem to be, as this webinar's title implies, making it work better. So our subject today is very much going to be around some of the thoughts and ideas that need to be deployed if we want to get greater levels of success out of our projects. So, as promised, who have we got today that's going to be in that conversation? And first of all, Fred Vitale. Fred, a long-term member of IACCM. Had the pleasure of working with you, Fred, on a number of previous programs of one sort or another. As you can see, Fred is Senior Manager and Principal Director at Accenture. And your specialism is very much in this sort of field, Fred, so welcome.
Thank you.
And secondly, we have Jack Lead. Jack is the Vice President of Sales and Services at 8over8. And for those of you who aren't familiar with 8over8, it's a very long-standing provider, particularly strong in the oil and gas sector. And we've had the pleasure of featuring 8over8 and their thought leadership topics on a number of previous webinars. So, Jack, very much welcome to you.
Thank you, Tim.
And well, the last one on that particular triage of photos is, of course, myself, and I think probably most people are aware of who I am and what I do, so let's just get moving and talk a little bit about what we're going to be covering today. As the title again implied, we're talking about a lot of the challenges, but more importantly, how to respond to those challenges in project contract management. And I'm sure during that conversation as well, Jack, we're going to get some pretty good insights to the 8over8 risk management platform, ProCon, and I'm sure you've got some pretty interesting stories to share with us of how some of your clients and contacts have been managing to improve. So we've got a few questions that we particularly want to answer around complex project delivery improvement, more a proactive approach, and that certainly is one of, I think, the critical things that everybody's looking at today. Digital technologies particularly are clearly transforming our ability to start being more proactive in anticipating issues, but also putting together and structuring things in a better way so that we have anticipated the repetitive issues that tend to hit projects. And fundamental to all of this, certainly in our view, is technology, and getting the right technologies can be really challenging. So with that, let's just move to our next and first, if you like, bit of the storyboard here. This is actually a quote that came out of the Sunday Times in the UK just a couple of weeks, 3 weeks ago. A global boom in project management, creating jobs, more than 15.7 million new roles worldwide, according to this particular extensive article, in fact, in that Sunday newspaper. So, Fred, what do you think of that?
There's no question about it. The reality is that most of the project managers are aging up and aging out of the business. I mean, it's been estimated that about 10% of that workforce will never even return to the capital projects that they've been supporting over the past couple of years. So, an enormous opportunity for anybody who wants to learn how to put together a project, you know, in all of its phases.
And Jack, have you any thoughts on this statistic?
Yes, Tim. I mean, we see a real dearth in talent when it comes to contract administration, really globally in all of these large, complex projects. Each owner of a project typically has a couple of really senior well-educated, well-seasoned individuals who can do this, but that's all you have to kind of go around, and it's a resource distribution problem in our opinion. So I believe this as well.
So I think, of course, very interesting questions with the shifts in technology, the moves towards things like artificial intelligence increasingly being adopted. I saw the head of the Senate Armed Forces Committee recently commented that, for example, things like the federal acquisition regulations are now way beyond the capability of any human mind to deal with them. And in fact, they're deploying artificial intelligence to undertake a lot of the acquisition activities in the Defense Department, because they believe it's the only way they can get not only compliance with the regulation, but more importantly that they can operate with greater speed and intelligence in the projects they're undertaking. And there's plenty of discussion going around, of course, about what professions, what jobs will actually survive in our new digital age with artificial intelligence systems and other advanced techniques that are going to change the world of work. And The Future of Work is a book that's about to come out, which looks really interesting. The Future of the Professions is one that we featured at our recent European conference. I think the one thing that you can say for sure is that roles that are about exercising judgment and providing coordination across multiple stakeholders will be roles that in many cases will survive much better than specialist activity. Specialists are based very much on knowledge, whereas integrators are often based much more on coordination and judgment. Artificial intelligence will be good at the knowledge side of things. It will not be so good at the judgment side of things. So I think to the points you've both made, but of course, whether or not that really exercised tremendous growth in project management, or whether it's contract management, or whether it's an integration of the two, a lot of interesting, I think, potential discussion in that area. But one thing's for sure, those jobs of coordination and integration are going to remain very important for business health and success. So that, in a sense, I suppose, begins to touch on this question, then what does it mean for contract management? And well, obviously, Jack, you just commented, you certainly see a dearth of skill very often in this area, and therefore, I guess, an opportunity, a need both for project managers probably to enhance their contracts and commercial understanding and competence, but also a good opportunity for the growth of contract management. What do you think, Fred?
There's no question about it. Contract management is what binds the project together. The big challenge in the capital project, because of its complexity and because of the way projects have grown, is that each one of these contracts has to seamlessly allow the people managing to go from one to the other and understand what the responsibilities and service requirements of each one of them is. So from that standpoint, it just means more of a focus on contract management, more of a focus on understanding the life cycle and making sure you have the right tools to do the job.
And Jack, any thoughts from you that you'd want to add to those comments?
Yeah, Tim, we really see a push towards the holistic view around the life cycle that Fred mentioned for the contract management. So a real focus on front end and then moving into procurement, moving to construction, and then actually a handover into production, and understanding all the stakeholders and documenting communications along the way, and using what you called artificial intelligence or big data to surface all of that in a very easy to use format for decision support in real time. So we really see this as expanding.
And one of the big challenges, I guess, Jack, this is one that has a lot of technologies have not really been too successful dealing with, is that we're often, of course, not really looking at one-to-one relationships, are we? I mean, certainly in a complex project, we're really looking at one-to-many. In other words, there's a complex and interdependent supply network that usually needs to be coordinated, which of course implies in itself multiple contracts, not just one.
Not only multiple contracts, Tim, but we're actually seeing a lot of hybrid contracts where we used to see mostly LSDK type 100% progress quantities known kind of contracts, and now we see the combination of unit pricing, cost reimbursable, plus some LSDK. And really that is an effort to allocate risks where the risk can be handled by certain parties, either the owner or the contractor. And so in the striving to meet schedule and budget on these large complex projects, we see more complex contracts. We see a bigger network, as you said, one to many, which need to collaborate. And that really drives the need for technology and some processes and the talent pool that needs to manage this.
Interesting. So certainly, as you say, demanding and sort of an incredibly dynamic environment that's created, particularly, of course, in an environment where, as in certainly fields like oil and gas and mining, you know, we've got such amazing sort of cost implications from the collapse of prices. So just moving on to our next slide, I suppose reinforcing in a way one or two of the things that we've touched on already. This quote from the UK's National Audit Office, which produced a remarkable report on contract management dated 4th September 2014 for anybody who would like to get a copy. To me, actually, probably the most compelling expose and commentary on the importance of contract management that I've ever seen. A very comprehensive document and absolutely reinforcing the call and the urgency of the initiatives being taken by the UK government to embed commercial capability and contract management competence across government. And of course that's been driven by the fact that public services are increasingly getting delivered by third parties. And I guess, Fred, that's absolutely true of the industry you touch as well. More and more use of third-party providers in order to give greater flexibility, greater access to the skills that are needed at a moment in time. But obviously some real challenges when you move to that more fragmented, interdependent organizational model.
You're absolutely right. The challenge, to a large extent, is understanding the service responsibilities and the service agreement between all of those parties, and not killing innovation. Because as things change, the contracts have to change and the people have to change, who are in fact managing that. So it is a large problem, no question.
And Jack, one of the ways that senior management hasn't taken things seriously enough is that when you look at the critical importance that we're describing for contract management, it really is quite remarkable how little real investment there is in technology to support it, isn't it?
Yes, Tim, there is. And I think it's maybe a lack of the ability to articulate the value proposition to get the right tools and process and people in place for the contract management. I believe some of the project cost controls, the scheduling, and the financial systems have positioned themselves earlier in these cycles and for many years to be very important. And I think contract management is going to see that type of importance in the next 1 to 5 years.
And are you getting more confident about the ability to describe that return on investment?
As we gather more global clients, we work with Shell globally, BP, Chevron, Santos, Woodside. We get more use cases. We understand the processes better. Yes, we're getting very well articulate the savings of a large integrated project can be up to 5 to 10% of the total budget of the project if the contract management is done holistically and correct.
So some pretty compelling data, and certainly would accord with, of course, the sort of research data that we've been unearthing. I think one of the major points to us, of course, with the technology point is that organizations have invested a phenomenal amount of money on streamlining internal communication through ERP systems and other applications. Yet, of course, when you look at the critical importance of the relationships they have with external suppliers or customers, it is actually very interesting that despite the fact that those are the things that really drive their revenues, there's been virtually no investment in technology to support those relationships.
Absolutely, Tim. It's mostly been email and spreadsheets to date, and I think that's going to change. So,
well, and it leads us nicely to the next slide, which tells us attitudes are changing. So do you want to pick up on this one again, Fred, or would you like me to just get it started?
You can start it, Tim.
Okay. Well, so as we're saying here, obviously much too high a proportion of trading relationships and projects underperform. Depending on the type of project, there's pretty reliable data around that suggests certainly at the more complex end of projects, some 65 to 70% underperform in a variety of ways. Some recent work that was done by the European Commission, for example, said that 65% of mega projects either fail or fail to come in on budget. Their data suggested that some 19% of those projects deliver nothing of any value, and on average they're 2 years late and 80% over budget. As you go down the scale and move away from mega projects into just more normal projects, then you still unfortunately get similar percentages which finish up over budget or over time. So there's clearly massive room for improvement, either in the quality of estimating or in the quality of delivery. And certainly many people are recognizing that the excellence of commercial activity in terms of better understanding and evaluating projects in the first place, and of the competence at managing and putting in place the right contract and then managing it effectively is equally important. But for management, of course, it really becomes a question that as they begin to look at that need for commercial and contracting capabilities, what is it that they should do first? Is it an issue predominantly of the process? Is it the contracts and the relationship definition itself? Is it the personnel, the skills that are available? Is it the measurements that are being used, perhaps driving and incentivizing the wrong behaviors? Or is it the lack of at all, or the lack of appropriate tools and systems? Or indeed, is it all of those? So what do you think, Fred? Some of them? All of them? And where might you begin if you were trying to fix it?
So typically we'll want to start with the strategy, okay? The reason the strategy becomes important is that it defines what are the real goals of the overall project and basically provides that structure of aligning everybody so that way they could achieve that business case or that goal. Behind that, usually the second step is really focused on the process that is needed to, in fact, ensure success. So process could include contracts, it could include contract life cycle, it could be focused on where do communications lie and what are the interfaces for all of those communications. From there, we would typically be very concerned about the relationships, be very concerned about the personnel, and do they have the right skills? And once again, are the right tools in place to make this all function correctly? As Jack pointed out, you know, the days of the spreadsheet are gone. The reality of the situation is that information has to flow freely between groups. It has to be clear, and it's up to each of the parties, whether they're in their silo or across their silo, to really understand what are the ultimate goals and how they align as individuals to making sure those are a success.
And certainly I think a few other points you've covered there are absolutely borne out with our experiences and research. In fact, I was mentioning, I think, when we were talking the other day, the work that was done by Professor Rob Hanfield from North Carolina State, head of supply chain school there, which was published in an edition of our Journal of Strategic Contracting and Negotiation last year. And time and again you see the importance of communication, but what Rob's research pointed out was that it needs to be the right sort of communication. And in fact, one of the things that he discovered was that one of the ways that you can identify a project that's in trouble is by the volume of email that's being exchanged. Communication, I suspect, absolutely at the heart, Jack, of what you seek to enable through technology.
Absolutely, Tim. ProCon platform is unique in that most people have a document-centric or data-centric world that they're looking at, and ProCon is a communication-centric platform. So when you go back to Fred's point about strategy and you're sitting down with your contractors and you're trying to get alignment and all the stakeholders, there's defined standard communication types that ProCon will have in it that you'll define with your stakeholders. And there could be 50 or 100 of these different communication types. And this is the way that you categorize all these communications and you link all these communications and understand who has commented on it, consulted on it, approved it. The documents are attached to these communications. And when you're ready to go look at variation orders or technical deviation requests or application for payments, you can find those very easily in our system through those communications. And again, when you get back to strategy, one thing I'll add to Fred's comments is when you have a good system like ProCon in place, you can start looking at contract performance analysis. I think a lot of people look at vendor performance analysis, but they don't look at contract performance analysis. And when you have vendors over years, certain vendors perform much better under certain contract types, and it can change by location and it can change by function. And ProCon gives you the portfolio analysis to look at this and really come up with the right contracting strategy, which has been proven through history to work best with certain contractors that you're going to sit down and define these communications with, define that contract strategy, and define the risk allocation between the two partners on who's able to handle those risks the best to enable that project to succeed.
Well, certainly even be able to find the documentation sounds a bit revolutionary in its own right.
Yeah, it does indeed.
So indeed, then some of the key challenges that we see coming up again and again, but also the areas that are, I suppose, you know, we've got the title challenges, but of course many of them for many organizations are really key opportunities, aren't they? Because you were just touching, Jack, on an example of that with the power of technology today to provide analytics, and we're certainly beginning to see some really exciting examples of that with the scale of data that actually today our contract management community can begin to take advantage of to really drive not just project performance, but actually a lot of the strategic decisions that need to be made to make project competence, if you like, something that's core to the organization. And I suppose, Fred, more and more companies really having to compete on that issue of competence.
No question about it. And the other thing that people may not realize is as we get into this world of having big data available, we can actually test a lot of hypotheses, a lot of assumptions, and be able to make better decisions while we're using that data. Recently we got involved in logistical studies, and our client was thinking that we were going to analyze just 10 lanes of traffic and do a hypothesis-based analysis. In reality, even with simple tool, we were able to do over 1,000 lanes of traffic and be able to analyze who were the best suppliers, what was the best contracting approach, and what was the best pricing in all of those lanes. So it's definitely a changing world.
Indeed, yes, we've got a number of similar examples. And Jack, I mean, we've got claim management highlighted here. Of course, oil and gas, rather like construction and engineering, has made a living on claim management, hasn't it? I mean, you know, the best claim manager is the one who wins. We like a good bit of contention because that's how we make our margin, or it's how we avoid bad suppliers taking advantage of us. So are we suggesting that that's a field that can actually change and become proactive?
I think so, Tim. I mean, one of the key things around claim management is proactively managing change. And ProCon has a very robust change management platform inside of it with the workflow and the communications. And you know, we predict change, just as you said, from the amount of email that people see. When you define these communication types and you can see that these variation requests are coming in at a faster rate, you can actually predict change is coming. And so you're always dealing with change, and you have some approved changes. We always show the pending amount of changes, and then you show the potential amount of changes. And that potential amount of changes is coming from the intelligence of those communications. And if you manage those changes appropriately immediately you reduce your claims. When a claim does arise and you have the history database of all the communications between you and all of your stakeholders, and they're connected in a way that you can see it from the first thread all the way through, and it may be 1,000, it may be 10,000 types of communications that you have to look at. And when you think of the magnitude of trying to go through 10,000 communications in email and piecing those together manually, it's an impossible task. But with a database like ProCon, you can connect those together, come up with the chronicle that tells you the history of that whole process of even when you had it as a potential change and it turned into a claim. And typically both parties can look at that history, which is very factual, single point of truth, and can negotiate that claim very quickly. And we actually track in our system negotiated savings on claims, because typically our project owners never pay the full claim. They always have enough data to prove somewhere that this was part of the original scope, or it was an error in the contractor arena, and they typically negotiate 20 to 30% of the cost of that claim and not the full claim, and then sometimes eliminate it altogether, either proactively or even after it's filed.
And I guess beginning to start seeing more in the way of predictive analysis based upon not only the individual claims, but the ability to consolidate and look for patterns across them.
No question. The predictive analytics have just really started in this field, and they're going to increase tremendously. I mean, another place where you can see in a predictive way where you're going to have maybe change or a claim coming up is in the obligations analytics that we do. So we make sure that everyone knows the obligations of the time of response to every type of communication, and we have analytical data that show obligation type and which ones are overdue, how long they're overdue. And this is really what drives schedule delays, it drives changes, it drives claims. So many times, classically, you have contractors sitting saying, hey, we're just waiting on the project owner to tell us what to do. That's an overdue obligation, probably sitting in someone's email box. Person may be traveling on vacation. We tell the whole team, we give many notifications, we make sure that the obligation's known up the chain of command, and making sure that those obligations are met, because every missed obligation usually means money, and it's usually money to the project owner.
Very good. So let's just move on again, and let's just then talk about some of the key challenges. Fred, would you like to kick off with what you see then as the key challenges, and Jack, if you want to jump in on that as well, and intersperse it a little bit with, I suppose, some comments on best practice in dealing with those key challenges.
Yeah, Tim, some of the keys to success, okay, in project delivery are really developing a highly developed culture of project delivery excellence. In other words, making sure the entire team understands the goals, understands the tools, understands how they can work together to be as efficient as possible. The second one is efficient and timely decision making. As the folks at 8over8 have mentioned, the real key there is making sure that the information's available, making sure it's accurate, and being able to use it to make the right decisions. Third, integrated project management methodology, including guidelines and tools, so that way everybody feels like they're part of the organization. And then a systematic use of KPIs to monitor delivery of capital projects. Very traditionally, people only look at cost, they look at schedule, they look at quality, and they don't look about what's driving all of those things. Well, those being lagging indicators are really not the things to be looking at as you try to work with a complex project. Minimizing the number of changes, okay, so that way you don't have to deal with change management and you don't have to deal with all these modifications. Increasing access of performance data on projects, and then the effective management or transition of capital projects from capital projects themselves to operating assets. The one point that I want to make very clear is once again, the importance of contract lifecycle and the importance of making sure that you've got the contracts right. If you get them right at the beginning, it's really about maintaining them. It's really about using innovation and testing them and making sure that they really function. And to do that, you not only need great tools, but you need really highly skilled contract managers. And even if it's project managers and training project managers to do it right, it's making sure that it sticks and that you keep with the program as you move these contracts through that life cycle.
Some great points, and Jack, probably ones that you would endorse. Any other points that you would raise as to the key challenges that you're seeing that are facing these complex projects?
Yeah, Tim, I mean, those are great points by Fred, and I do agree with all those. I believe that, you know, the alignment of the stakeholders is very critical, and as we said before, it's one to many these days, and the stakeholders that we find are JV partners. They can be investors. A lot of times senior management in the project owner organizations are out of the loop when it comes to really what's going on within the project and within the contracts. The communications with the contractors, the communications actually regulators, environmental and OSHA, these are all stakeholders in the project, and making sure that you understand what their roles are, how you're going to communicate with them, and what the risks are in that relationship management with all the stakeholders are very critical, and ProCon does that. The other part where we look at the Gaussian curve of, let's say, a talent organization for contract admin and associated people, as I said, everybody has one or two real senior, really good contract management individuals that they like to deploy on their complex projects. What we find is if you actually understand your company's best practices. ProCon does come with a template that we've built over 15 years, which has the oil and gas best practices in it. But every time we implement it, we always do the workshops, and we always find that it's slightly changed, maybe 10, 15, 20% changes in that blueprint to fit the culture of the organization that's delivering these projects. And once you get those things in place and you get your templates in place for your contracts, competitive bid templates, sole source templates, and you really understand which ones work for your organization, we believe that the entire pool of talent in that organization and their performance is increased to be very similar to the best performance individuals that you had before, without the defined process and without the defined piece of platform and technology and communications that can bring that whole organization performance up to a very superior level. So our goal is to improve the project delivery, but also to improve the human performance within all the stakeholders of these capital projects, and I think that is very, very critical.
And for those who, of course, are interested in this, many of you will probably be familiar with our infographic, the 10 pitfalls of contract management, the areas that we've identified that are the biggest contributors to value erosion, value loss, or turning it the other way around, the 10 areas that perhaps represent the greatest opportunity for us as a community to add value. And of course, probably key amongst those is the challenge of clarity over scope and goals, which we know from working with our members is an increasing challenge, not just in terms of making sure that requirements and goals and scope are clear at the beginning, but of course that they're maintained and updated, because what we think we want is often quite different from what we actually find out we want, or where market shifts, of course, can take us, as they have with this industry, with oil and gas, with mining. Clearly, a lot of the goals have changed quite substantially with the price being what it is today. So I think some great data there. A few reports already issued, of course, on those 10 pitfalls, scope and goals, timing of commercial engagement, being 2 that have just been released, and the other 8 are on their way. So let's move along to our next slide, and we touched before on the challenge of delivery record. Fred, I think this was some data that you'd gathered, so let me pass this one again to you.
Yeah, this points to the challenge that people face. The reality is that whether it's an energy project or whether it's any of the other industries that that deal with complex projects, the challenge is to be able to make sure that you understand the business case and you're actually delivering on that business case. It seems to be highly common that the project teams, as they go through these projects, don't deliver on that business case and really challenge their organizations which have actually funded it throughout that period of time. Once again, it's not about the size of the project. It's about being able to do it right and bring the right best practices to the table and the right tools to the table to make sure it's successful. Public projects have the challenge, industry projects have the challenge, and obviously oil and gas projects also, or energy-related projects, have the challenge. The latest statistics that I've seen is that in the oil and gas industry, there's a prediction that projects will have to come in 40% of their value of what people paid for them approximately 5 years ago to be successful. That's a heck of a challenge in an industry that wasn't successful when we had $100 a barrel oil. So the reality is that there's going to be even more pressure on project management and contracting to do it right and do it efficiently.
Even more importance, I suppose, that there is cross-industry learning. I mean, one of the things that we see a lot here at IACCM, given the cross-industry nature of the association, is, of course, the fact that there's woefully few examples of really learning across projects. I mean, there's been a lot of very good work done, for example, in aerospace and defense on performance and outcome-based contracts, which other industries are perhaps only just beginning to grasp that this could be a way forward. Do you see much in the way of outcome or performance-based agreements, Jack?
No, not in oil and gas. I mean, the same thing in infrastructure where you have NEC3 contracting being the standard in Europe. You have FIDIC in the Middle East. There are some cross-industry learnings that we're trying to bring to the table. And one thing I would like to add to this project is really to production, but not only to production, but to nameplate production. And sometimes that's very, very difficult, and sometimes takes a year after the construction is done to get that production facility up to nameplate. And I think everybody probably knows that 8over8 is now owned by Aviva, and Aviva really is a digital asset engineering software strategy company. And what we have found is by defining the contract templates up front on what type of engineering tools, what type of databases, and what type of EPC data handover is done to the owner into the maintenance systems of the owner, really makes a difference on bringing that production plant up to nameplate quickly, because there could be anywhere from 50 to 100 change management projects on that production facility in the first 12 months to get that production all the way up to where it is. And to Fred's point, you don't get the ROI on that facility until it's at full production.
Indeed. So, projects increasing in size and complexity, Fred.
Yep, no question about it. When we think of projects, when we think of the big projects, we think of those huge offshore platforms, those main bridges that are being put up, those tunnels that are being bored. The reality is that size and complexity mean different things in the case of projects. They mean, how do you put all these pieces together? It could be an infrastructure project or IT-related project, and the challenges of how do all these pieces or how do all these things go together. It could be another infrastructure project where you actually have different stakeholders and different funding mechanisms which make the project extremely complex. As Jack mentioned, it could be a joint venture project where it's fairly simple, but the reality is that the stakeholders all have different needs and all have different wants associated with it. So when we talk of size and complexity, and you look at some of the statistics that are here and some of the key drivers, we're always concerned about, the regulatory knowledge. In other words, is the business case sound? Do we understand what are the things that are going to push it and where the regulations are going over the life cycle of this? Do we really understand what are the professional and craft skill challenges? And are those actually available within the marketplace? Aerospace goes through this continually in trying to find the right people who have the right skills to actually do the job. How can we ensure greater reporting accuracy, as Jack has talked about his tools? You know, making sure that those tools have good information coming in, making sure that people are able to use that from a data standpoint to do sensitivities, to make sure that they're communicating effectively. And then the last piece, which is also shown here, is the unforeseen contractor changes and the supplier constraints. The reality is that we are a global marketplace. You know, supply chains are stretched, whether it be for services or for materials. Making sure you've got the right tools which can track all of that, making sure you understand the implications of where you're buying things and what you're buying, and how you can mitigate and measure it and control the risk are really key to any project, especially as they become more and more complex.
And Jack, one of the things that I observe and continue to be quite disappointed by is very often the sort of immaturity and incompleteness of many of the sort of risk registers that I see, and particularly the failure of organizations to really openly share and discuss risk. Is that something you observe?
Well, yeah, we do. I mean, just to add to Fred's point, say on the procurement constraints globally, we have a stage gate process in ProCon which we drive all the procurement through and collaboration through, and we actually do a report that shows the whole calendar of every procurement. And there could be thousands of them, and each one, you know, has a start date and a planned end date, and you can see very, very quickly in a few seconds, actually, as a senior manager, where these procurements are delayed, and that is at the very beginning of these projects. And as those things get delayed at the beginning, it's very, very difficult to catch up, and some of them would be defined in a risk register, Tim, as a no-cost consequence schedule delay, but I think we all know that schedule delays is time, and time means money, and eventually it's going to cost you money. And so as we look at these analytics and we look at the changes and we look at the communications, we do assign schedule and cost risk to those within our system and surface that in the analytics, so the whole team, including senior management and staff, can understand where those risks lie and what the opinion of the best and the worst outcome of those risks are going to be.
So I'm very conscious of the fact that we've got some great questions here, so I'm going to try and move us along. So we've got a few minutes at the end to begin to get to those. So here we begin to touch on some of those best practices thoughts. Do you want to quickly take us through these, Fred?
Yeah, so comprehensive and rigorous front-end planning is really about knowing what that objective in mind and making sure that you're spending enough time to figure out what the strategy is. Make sure you've got the right tools, you make sure you've got the right people in place to be able to drive it. It also goes with innovation, making sure that whatever decisions are being made as you start the project, making sure that the innovation takes place and that you're using those tools to constantly test those ideas, so that way in the end you're bringing the best value to your company. Second one, developing and retaining talent. This is really about the war of talent globally. It's making sure that you've got the right people in the right place with the right tools and that they're communicating effectively between each other, so that way we're delivering that value. Last one, improving transition. Once again, Jack mentioned this about the reality that when construction ends, operation begins, and making sure that that's a smooth and seamless transition, so that way the project life cycle goes forward. Jack, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I'd like to add some new things we're looking at, Fred and Tim. One of the things we're exploring right now is something called contract-driven engineering. And since we now are part of Viva and we have the full engineering, detailed engineering suite to work with, engineering typically loves to engineer, and we see a lot of over-engineering happening and some engineering that would happen outside of the scope of the contract. And you really can't fault the engineering organization because there's no visibility really into what that contract constraints, limitations, and scope requirements are. And so our goal is to make a connection tech-wise, information-wise, and connect these stakeholders together so it's easily looked at from an engineering point of view and determined easily if they're engineering outside the scope of the contract. And we believe that a lot of the overruns in the feed area would benefit from this type of visibility and communication with the contracts organization, with the engineering organization. We've got about 10 other ideas in here with integrations. We talked about the one going from contractor over to the owner-operator. And it's not only the digital asset data, but we would also include the contract data within that data set. So when maintenance is occurring and that change project's occurring, and you can see now the engineering data very clearly, you're also going to be able to see the contract data very clearly. So you're going to be able to see back in the contracting phase what changes happened in the engineering, what changes happened in construction, who did those changes, why they do those changes, and all of that could be very insightful information to you to successfully complete that project in the production phase to get it up and running quicker. So those are some of the new things we're looking at.
Great examples, and certainly I'll absolutely endorse these three. We've certainly seen from our research that that rigor in the front end certainly pays a dividend in terms of the speed of execution. So we're often into false time saving, I think, with the pressures to do things fast at the beginning and not actually get the planning right. As far as the talent stuff is concerned, a lot of behavioral issues, in fact, there, and certainly the adversarial approaches that some organizations display, for example, in the way they go about their procurement and contract management, is one of the ways that they can alienate talent from their key suppliers. And thirdly, I think the whole transition area is one that is crying out for dramatic improvement and where automation can really play. But also, of course, this is where we're doing a lot of our work with contract simplification and contract design to facilitate transition processes, ease and quality of communication and understanding by users of what it is they're supposed to be doing. So, key to assuring that a contract is managed throughout its life, and the role of the technology acting as that single point of truth. Do you want to start with this one, Jack?
Certainly. Yeah, I think it's just a we've already talked about, Tim, so I won't spend a lot of time on it, but when you look at the holistic life cycle of a contract, you have to have actually the tool set, the processes in place, the people trained, and the stakeholders connected that can collaborate through that life cycle. And we see so many times that people in the industry feel like when they successfully bid, negotiate, and sign a contract, that's kind of the end of the life cycle of that contract. They don't really consider the post-award piece of the rigorous management of that contract to be part of the life cycle. And I think as data now is coming forward from a lot of your research and papers and a lot of the customers that we work with, it is maybe the most important part of the contract lifecycle management is the post-award. It is the analytics that surface from the post-award that gives a real-time decision-making support system in place for those stakeholders to make the best effective and efficient decisions to make sure that that project is delivered properly. So we believe, obviously it's always a mixture of everything, but if you have the perfect process and if you have trained people and you don't have the right platform and technology in place, it's still going to be almost impossible with the flow, amount, complexity of this data for those people to make the real-time decisions that they have to make correctly.
Which leads us actually very neatly, Jack, into one of our questions, a comment from one of our listeners. Our contract analytics requires considerable manual data input. Any suggestions on how to automate contract data input? And, well, clearly you've got some suggestions. You might like to comment more in the context of how complicated is it to make that shift from the manual to the automated?
Okay, that's a great question. Because when we go into clients, we find ourselves in two situations. You're either where a contract and project is already kicked off, and you're forced to migrate the data into a platform like ProCon, and that is a manual process. We're very good at it. We have scripts. We automate it, but it is taking all of the communications out of email. It is taking all of the data and classifying it under the communication standards within our system and putting it in there. The other case is where the project hasn't started yet, and that case is actually very easy because you define the communication types, you define the processes, you define the workflows, you define the business rules, and then everyone starts working in that system. And what people do is they write within the contract that they have with the contractor that every communication has to go through the portal of ProCon to be communicated with the owner. No other communications are accepted. No verbal, no voicemail, no email, anything. Everything has to be logged within the system, and it's all classified by a type of communication, which we call advanced communications management, and then documents and data are attached to those communications. So yes, there is some manual work if you start after a project has been already kicked off, but it's not a problem. But once you have the system set up and everyone trained, including your contractors trained and actually contractually obligated to communicate to you through the portal, it becomes very easy.
This one actually in a way more a comment than a question, but I think a good comment. More email, less talking to generate more analytical data. A paradox when we want more human interactions and relationships, and we know it's good to talk, to move swiftly. A new dilemma, a new field of expertise to know how to write and when to talk. I think a good observation, Fred. It is challenging today. I mean, what is the benefit, for example, of virtual negotiation as opposed to physical negotiation? We're having to make these judgments more and more, aren't we, in terms of the methodologies we use to communicate. And of course, with the digital age, that choice is going to grow even greater in terms of, do we use the written word, do we use the spoken word, or do we use visual forms and graphics and so on as our means of communication?
Absolutely. I mean, it's a big challenge. You know, as you go across different cultures, as you go across different companies which have different ways of doing things, making sure that you're using the right medium and making sure that it's clear, and as Jack put, you know, in the right system so it's documented, is becoming a bigger and bigger challenge.
But one, of course, that both challenges us and in a way enriches what we do. It is a matter of us being adaptive and continuing to change, just like, I suppose, this need to adapt, to adopt technology at all, but then also to think about the various different methods of technology. Certainly some of the companies we're working with that are moving towards more in the way of visual contracts, for example, recognizing that, of course, as you point, Fred, there, trying to use a consistent language, particularly in contracts where it's written in legalese, its own specific language, is very demanding. If you're using contracts more as an operational guide, operational document, is that something that you consider important, Jack?
Yes, I would like to add that we don't discourage face-to-face meetings and speaking. It is a human relationship, and we advocate that. What we advocate is, say, you know, uploading the kickoff meeting notes into the system, and one that was involved in those meeting notes approving that document for its accuracy. So we're never going to, I think, totally replace, you know, site instructions and site communications and kickoff meetings and performance reviews, which are held face-to-face, because some of those conversations can be quite difficult if someone's underperforming as a contractor on your project. But we do then upload that into a system, our system, ProCon, under a communication type that's been very rigorously defined, so that data can be used for analytics, it can be used for history, it can be used for legal purposes, if necessary, when claims arise.
Another question, if I may throw this at you, a big success from the aerospace and defense world is the introduction of collaborative development in projects, bringing suppliers and service providers in early and working together to develop the solution. And certainly that's something that we've observed quite extensively, and of course it's sometimes true in the technology space as well. Fred, how pervasive are you seeing that in the industries you cover?
Yeah, in reality today, when you look at an LNG facility, which is a rather large facility, it's actually been designed multiple times and it's standardized. So having the supplier actually show up and sit with the design team, work with the design team throughout its life, make sure that he's driving the standards based on what has already been done, is one of the standards or one of the leading practices that exists out there today. Yeah.
A few thoughts is the opening to this particular comment. The importance of hosting all assumptions in the contract in one location. Refer to them in the body, but keep them as an appendix. They will change. Secondly, contract management having to review those assumptions regularly and the contract to have a clear process for updating them. Thirdly, build in risk management, collaboration, and governance from day one. Good practices for you, Jack?
Yes, absolutely good practices, and necessary for success. And I would like to just one comment back on our last one is agile contracts, used in IT projects and some of the defense, and I also see more people going to sitting down with their contractors up front and putting all the terms and assumptions, risk, expenses, schedule on the table up front and documenting those very well, putting those into the system, and then having a performance review on those in the calendar, which is an obligation in the contract. So I totally agree.
So we have a couple of sort of final concluding slides here, and Jack, I think this is a nice one for you to just perhaps bring us to a close on, as we perhaps explain how we can actually build this superior connectivity to really drive the success of these complex projects.
Yeah, this is just a dashboard of the entire portfolio of all global business units, say, of a major oil company, and looking at how many business units is top left. It's 18 business units. What's the total approved contract values? 33 billion. What's the potential change? The numbers in red, it's 17% of that number, which is big. Total number of projects, and you can see the total number of projects and which ones are overrunning there in the bottom left. Top right, you're looking at communications, and it's 155,000 communications, and then the graph of which ones are overdue and what type of communications they are. And so back to how do you gather this data? This is all in ProCon because it's collected along the way. Everyone's using the process, everyone's using the tool, and these type of dashboards are very customizable. We build them to meet our clients' needs, and they're very drill down on this data, so you can push on one business unit, you can go to one project, you can go to one location, and you can actually see overdue obligations, for example, and is the team not performing like they should, and go have a performance review with that team and ask why. They may be understaffed. There could be very good reasons why they're underperforming, and they need resources. So this really gives the project team all the way through senior management very, very good real-time data to manage by exception, to see where the problems are, and to realign resources to solve the problems.
And of course it is through techniques and tools of this sort that we really begin to move contract management into that much more strategic role, really providing business management with the information it needs, not only on individual projects, but of course, as we've touched on, really beginning to see patterns and consistencies between projects and really being able to help management make better commercial decisions on policy practice and indeed areas like investment and disinvestment. So you're seeing that sort of role increasingly being performed, Fred?
Absolutely. As the complexity of projects grow, you need to be able to bring the right tools to make sure that you're making those right decisions. As it says here, it's really a holistic end-to-end approach, okay? It's being able to drive innovation through the life cycle. And as Jack has mentioned, and yourself, Tim, a number of times, it's making sure you've got good records and good documentation so that way you're making the best decision that you possibly can with all of that data that you're starting to collect as we move into the future of capital project contracting.
So an era of tremendous change, tremendous uncertainties for many. Obviously, as we touched on right at the beginning, many question marks over the roles of the future, the jobs of the future, and how technology is going to impact them. But I think, as hopefully our audience has experienced today, in many respects a time that's really exciting for those of us in this field of contracts and commercial management, because I would say, and I'd be very interested as a final word, Jack and Fred, I would certainly take the view that it's a time of very real opportunity rather than a time of tremendous threat.
Fully agree.
Yes, I believe the opportunity, because the pressure of this industry to perform and deliver these projects for ROI with the current state of the global market is extremely high pressure and volatility. And so I think people are really looking at the new technologies, the new processes to try to bring these projects in for the ROI that they're designed to give.
Jack, Fred, thanks so much for being with us today. I hope you, our audience, have found this helpful and interesting. Obviously, you have here the contact information for Fred and Jack if you'd like to get in touch with either of them. And for those of you who maybe didn't manage to get to your question, I do apologize. We'll make sure that those questions go out to Jack and Fred so that they have the opportunity to feedback any comments or observations that may be appropriate. Otherwise, thank you again, Fred, Jack, for spending this time with us, and with that we'll say goodbye.